I had an amazing conversation with a doctor the other day. This was the first time since I've been, at least here, that I've been able to talk to somebody and interviewing because nobody speaks the language. It is a difficult thing to walk through like a ghost because nobody speaks English, and the only thing that you can do is point and get across basic yes or no in the way that you engage with people. It shocked me that he was speaking English to me, but this allowed for a larger conversation that got into politics. And not just got into politics, you get to see the differences in culture. I often argue on this channel that environment creates the individual, that it's difficult to find a distinction between who the individual is versus where they're soaking into. They incorporate things in how they were raised, in their culture, in their political climates, into who they are. It makes up their worldview, and oftentimes the individual may feel like this is the most natural thing in the world, and they may even feel like they've had pure choice and determination in this. Nonsense. Nonsense. Where you came from, how you were raised, how the person raised you, whether the person was an asshole, whether your parents were drunks, whether your parents were loving, whether like all of these things, it just soaks into who you are. Now, one experience after the next, leaving indelible scars, or for that matter, positives within your fabric of your being. And those things, there's an element to the person that's the person, but that element to the person is soaking and interacting with the world and the society to which that person belongs into. Whether the person had their needs met is another one of those main things. Whether the people who were raising them were kind or soft or loving or strict or authoritarian. All of these things affect the individual. People make this argument about nurture or nature, and I would put to you that it's probably a little bit of both. If there's something wrong with the physical form, let's say you have some kind of defect mentally for psychopathic behavior, whether those genes are expressed or not may be in turn on how you were raised. Meaning, if that person was raised in an area that was harsh and unloving and unforgiving, then those genes will be expressed in probably the worst forms. Like it's both. It's not nature or nurture. A person may have something wrong with their brain where they don't necessarily process all that well, or comprehend reality all that well, or objective reality. Maybe the person is Down syndrome. Maybe there's some other genetic defect that's built into the person's physical form. It's both. It's not one or the other. It's both. But if you're talking about just average Joe with nothing wrong with that particular individual, your environment dictates behavior. One of those things is seen when you're traveling and you get the opportunity to talk to someone. And especially when it's a vastly different background as opposed to your own. And I'm having a conversation with this doctor. It started in such an odd way because we're talking about medical stuff and talking about the American medical system. And even though he came across as a capitalist, healthcare was an area where he was dramatically against there being a market. He said the system that you guys have in the United States is insane. I can't believe that you guys will push and keep a system like that where you have so many people without access to healthcare. So that's the first point. But when we started getting into a bit of an argument, where at a certain point I stopped pushing back on him and started trying to figure out how he was raised. And what I realized was he was raised during the Soviet era, meaning he grew up during the time where the Soviet Union was taking over Poland. If we remember, Poland was split between the Nazis and the Soviets. And despite all of the proclamations from Western powers, France and Britain, that they would protect Poland, they would look out for Poland's interests and all this other stuff, when it came down to it, Poland was severed and split between Nazis and between the Soviet army. Britain did declare war, but Britain didn't do anything after declaring that war because Britain at that point was a brittle empire and it took time for it to marshal its forces. Now, this is the context that he's talking from. He lived through this era where, going to the supermarkets, he was making this point of Yeah, when we went to the supermarkets, we were given these kind of stamps, but you couldn't really buy anything with stamps. So, you know, chocolate wasn't necessarily something that they can get their hands on. And he said, you look across the world and you would see the other countries had things that we didn't have, and you would question why you didn't have those things. He said, what you could do, though, is buy stuff on the black market. So even though the Soviets tried to weed out markets, black markets formed because people didn't have access to some of the things that they needed or some of the things that they wanted. That said, you know, having the money to buy those things on the black market, especially because during the black market, those things were dramatically more expensive than what you would typically pay for if you bought them in a typical straight way. So he has this memory of a child not having access to chocolate, and I wondered whether or not that completely colored his point of view of the political sense of the Soviet Union. By the same token, wasn't really any homelessness. If somebody needed medical care, they had access to medical care. His issue was, well, don't you need markets? And I said, well, what, like for healthcare? He says, no, healthcare is something different. But being in the Soviet era, being in the communist rule, he has a thing of being his bonnet about having markets. Same thing with, oh God, what is her name? Ayn Rand. Same thing. She's coming out of this kind of Soviet system, in which case she goes dramatically to the opposite side of the system, not able to take into account that this is a gradient. It's not necessarily one side or another. There is a gradient. So plowing to that, we get into a political conversation. And I've met several people who've had conversations similar to this guy, and they have a dramatically different perspective than I do on militarization. From their standpoint, he's like, well, you can't be utopian about this stuff. You can't really trust Vladimir Putin. And I said, well, fair enough. And he points to Donald Trump. He says, well, don't you think he did some things right? I said, what do you think that Donald Trump did right? And he says, well, you know, the tariffs on China. I said, yeah, but they turned around and put their own tariffs. He says, yeah. He says, but the U.S., you know, is more involved in that. I said, well, what about the positioning, putting military bases around both countries? Meaning we're surrounding them with weapons, dealing with NATO. Now, from this point, I could tell that the conversation we were having, he was not pleased with this conversation, but I didn't know why he wasn't pleased with the conversation. And finally, it came out. He made the point that 90% of Poland hates Russia. He said, because of the history of the Soviet era, Poland is dramatically antagonistic to the interests of Russians. And he said if you ask 90% of the population, 90% of the population would agree with that statement. He also goes further and making the point that Vladimir Putin is not an honest actor. And I said, well, I don't think any of them are honest actors. I said, he says, well, what about them just taking the ships recently? I said, I agree with you. He says, don't you think they're going to go further? Now, this gets into this issue of NATO. And I was like, well, no, I don't think he's going to attack a NATO nation, if that's what you're asking me. And he says, why don't you think that? I said, why do you think that? I said, certainly the other countries will respond to that. There's no way. I said, maybe if you're talking about Estonia, I don't necessarily know if we'd kick everything in gear for Estonia, but for Poland and the country the size of Poland, and to go that far, I think NATO would absolutely activate. To this, he shocked me. He says, I don't know why you think that. Now, this gets into historical stuff from the standpoint of culture. I was raised in a militaristic, violent culture of the United States, where NATO was sacrosanct, and this idea of countries not responding if NATO country is attacked was just not on the table. It was automatic. From his standpoint, he lived in a country where assurances were given to the population prior, and despite assurances given to his population, when they were attacked, it took Western powers, God knows how long, to liberate those countries, and even then, essentially left NATO under the domain of Soviet Union. He doesn't necessarily have this high level of confidence that if they were attacked, that anybody would do anything about it. Essentially, the question is, will the United States be willing to go to a nuclear war in order to protect Poland? I think the answer is yes. I could be wrong, but I think the answer is yes. He's not so sure. But again, he's not so sure out of cultural reasons that come from what Poland had went through. Vladimir Putin being a dishonest actor. So him and I got into this conversation also, slight debate, on the United States' role in the world from the standpoint of military. I've had a conversation with another cat from Denmark who took a similar position on this stuff. If you bring up the Iraq War or Libya, they were like, yeah, we don't like that, we don't like that. But if you bring up this thing of militarization, then that is overtly angry at that part. Now, part of that is because in their minds, the United States is the wall that prevents this Russia from essentially gobbling their countries up. They think that the Red Menace could have essentially swallowed them whole if it wasn't for the United States intervention into Europe. And so for them, NATO is considered to be a shield, even though the Soviet Union has gone belly up. From my standpoint, I made the point to him. I said, especially when we were talking about the Ukraine, I said, we fomented a revolution in that country. And in fomenting a revolution in that country, this is, it's not an issue of right or wrong, it's an issue of cause and effect. The country is absolutely going to respond because this is in that country's interest to respond. Countries tend to do things that are in their best interests, especially the larger countries, when they can blow off any kind of UN pressure on them. Russia is such a country. And so, from the standpoint of NATO fomenting a revolution and putting another NATO nation potentially on its border, it responded like any country would respond. The United States was willing to go to a nuclear war over missiles being put into Cuba, but we're not supposed to understand why a country that's been invaded multiple times, had millions of people killed in multiple incursions, why they wouldn't be a little sketchy or itchy about having an organization hell-bent on their destruction on their border. He agreed with me on this. He was an honest actor. He agreed with me. He said, you're right. He says, but you can't trust Putin and you can't be utopian about this stuff. I said, fair enough, but we are literally supporting Nazis in the Ukraine that are killing Russians. I said, let's be honest about what we're talking about. I also kind of made the point to him that we're spending $1 trillion a year, and in spending $1 trillion a year, we have places that don't have clean water. We have areas in California and Washington where you have towns of homeless. You have infrastructure that's falling apart. And in addition to having infrastructure that's falling apart, if you ever try to travel on the trains in the United States, in comparison to Europe, they're embarrassingly ancient. Like, I was trying to make the point to him that the amount of money that we're spending on military, while the other areas of civilian life suffer for it, it needs to change. Now, I'm not part of a country that was invaded, and eventually not being part of a country that was invaded, my perspective is from a country that has been military and policing of the world. From his perspective, he is part of a country that's been invaded. He lived under Soviet Union and communist rule. He made the argument that the civilian public hated the communist rule. He said they lost completely when the government changed over. Like, literally was wiped out entirely. The public itself was completely against the Soviet or the communist system. He even went into propaganda. I started asking him questions about propaganda. And I said, during our election campaign, the first thing they did was blame Russians. I said, despite the fact that Republicans cheated, both parties were looking to blame somebody else, meaning Democrats were blaming the Russians, Republicans were blaming immigrants. The public itself doesn't necessarily buy the Russia thing. When you look at the public and their interests, it's about things that matter to them. This is not one of those things. This is somewhat of a propaganda stunt. He said the propaganda that used to be put out was utter nonsense. He says, despite them putting it out, the political class and the establishment media at that point was completely discredited. And as such, the public didn't believe the information that was being put out because the information was somewhat laughable. Anytime there was, let's say, yield shortages, they would blame the West, in which people would be like, it's not the West that's responsible for this. I asked them whether or not it had more to do with the fact that they were being like the Western countries wouldn't deal with them. Meaning it wasn't a situation where, it was a situation that because the Western countries essentially isolated them, meaning everything that took place had to take place purely internal to the countries themselves, that they weren't getting assistance from outside of themselves. Now he said, no, I'm not necessarily believe that answer is right. But he said no. He said, the system was just busted, and they didn't necessarily want to take responsibility for the fact that the system was busted. It was a fascinating conversation. Like I said, I've had a conversation with a guy from Denmark, who him and I got into this argument about the Iraq War that lasted for like 4 hours. My wife was like, "Oh my God, you cut this short." But Europeans are interesting on this point because of where they come from. I mean, ultimately, they've been in multiple world wars. Their countries and populations have been devastated by those wars. And this is the context to which they've grown up in. My context is America. So I love these conversations. These conversations are always fascinating. I wish I could have had him on, like literally bring him on for an interview, but I'm pretty sure he had better things to do. So, Cloud Illusion, Jamal, will you be visiting a Saudi embassy in Turkey on your trip? Fuck no. Fuck no. Elephant So Coke, Jamal, you're wrong there. I know a lot of Americans who still believe in Russiagate. The majority of them do, at least among liberals, because I don't associate with conservatives. So, yes and no. Like, if you ask the public, if you just, when they do polls, and they do polling on, do you believe that Russia has something to do with the election thing? They may say yes, because they've been saturated with it. If you ask them, does it matter? The answer becomes like 1%. Like, Democrats only make up, 20-30% of the population. And so just because the ire might be up with them, that's not necessarily indicative of everyone else. So that's what I mean by that. People who aren't just biased hacks, who are completely within the Democratic Party system that needs to explain why Hillary Clinton lost, the rest of the public doesn't look at this as being a major issue. It's the liberal class that looks at this as an issue because they want to justify why Clinton lost to reality show hosts. So I just want to make that clear so we understand. That's true. Poland continues support of the new Ukrainian government and criticism of the Russian interference that anger Russians for increased tensions between the two countries. Yes. Yes. Garnome, he's going there to get a new marriage license. Fuck no. A man vanishes in the embassy. God, man, you have no idea. I wish they would have just said he was abducted by aliens. They should have just said that and went with it. He was abducted by aliens. That's as far as we know what took place. I mean, yes, he came in, but he was abducted by aliens, and they should have just stuck with that. That would have been just as believable as a story that they put out, which was unbelievable completely. So, all right, I'm going to end this here. I thought the story was interesting. Not many people are going to care about the story, but I can always look back on it as a reminder if I'm trying to think about this later. That said, I think it's fascinating to hear other cultures. Like, he's a product of his culture. He's a product of the history of that particular place where they were, the things that they were taught, his understanding of the way those things were taught, and his application of those things in the way that he operates in the world. Like, he would say that all of this was self-determination. He was a thinking individual. There was an issue of will where he chose to do all of these things. I would say nonsense. Free will didn't play any part of this. He was a product of his society, just like I am a product of my society and everybody else is a product of their environment, with a kernel of himself that's him. But ultimately, that kernel is responding to environmental phenomena. It is not a thing unto itself, even though there may be a bit of code in it that kind of gives certain instructions on how to respond. It ultimately will move in the direction of incentives and society. So, and by moving in the direction of society, I just mean it responds to it. Either it pushes the stuff away or it accepts it, but it's still responding to the elements within the society itself. Where he starts and where the society ends, or what are those things that's hard to figure out. So, fascinated by this conversation. I try to highlight these conversations whenever I get the opportunity to have. Yes, everyone who I spoke to and lived under Soviet rule said it sucked. Yes, he said it sucked magnificently. Like, part of his animosity towards Russia now is for living under the Soviet system. So yeah, he was unequivocal about it. But the Soviet system is not what lefties are pushing for, at least not the lefties that I talk to or I know. I mean, for me, I don't know what that system looks like. What I do know is that it's not this, and I want to move the ball further to the left to make people's lives easier. life, the point of life is not toiling away. The point of life is living. And if I can help people get from the cradle to the grave in ways that are less difficult and less caustic to them as individuals. And this is not just a morality thing. I keep saying, for me, this is more of a cause and effect thing. What is the world that you want? How do you get that world? And do you get that world by being just and fair and earnest? Or do you get that world by trying to essentially take and steal and rob and attack? I get the world that I want, which in my head is this kind of Star Trek-esque universe, by the former. You can call it morality to some degree, but I would argue that no justice, no peace. I'm not going to get my peaceful world if there's not justice in that world. I hope that makes sense. It's not purely just morality for the sake of morality. There's an element to this of, if you want your society to be better, less caustic, less people killing themselves. I saw a report the other day about the number of homicides to death rate, or the rate at which people are dying in the country going up. All of those things are brought about by a sick society. And that society changes when the operating system of society changes, and not before. The system is sick. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you immediately jump to a Soviet system, which apparently was just as sick, if not worse. There needs to be some medium and something different. And it is, I'm with Slavoj Zizek on this. I don't necessarily know what that completely looks like, but I know it doesn't look like this. And I know we can do better than what we have been doing. Yeah, I'll end it here. All right, guys, if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Clyde Illusion, I wonder how Edward Snowden likes Russia. I suppose he likes it better than a jail cell that the United States was going to put him in for releasing factually true information. So I am curious about that myself. I end it here. Thanks all.